Hello, this is Mr. Smith with Honors Economics Daily Participation. This is the same screen as yesterday, labor and earnings, because this is just the second part of that. And I want to continue talking about how different skill levels and other factors and characteristics lead to differences in pay. And so there is a value in skill. And with this, of course, we hope to see that the difference between different demographic groups like men and women will be more equalized, but that doesn't necessarily always happen. So why does the increase in value happen in relation to skills? Well, there's two hypotheses. One is it's based on international trade. We are having more exports, and that needs to be made with skilled labor. And so that means that it values the skilled labor more and more. Or it can be a skill bias technological change. New technologies require skilled workers. And so we need those people to come in and work with the new tools that are invented. And so therefore, since there's higher demand for that supply of labor, then the wages are going to go up. In relation to skill, there's also some different types of terminology that's used in reference to education and skill and some different theories that exist. One of them would be the signaling theory of education. And it is the belief that firms use education level to sort between high ability and low ability workers. The difficulty of earning a college degree demonstrates to the employer that this college graduate is more capable in theory. Yet the education itself has no impact on productivity or skill. So maybe they do have this education and it doesn't mean anything. But the fact that they went through this program, were ambitious enough to complete it, is a sign that they'll be more productive. And there are a couple other terms that you might hear, for instance, the learning effect. This is a theory that education increases productivity and therefore results in higher wages. So this one believes that it actually does increase the actual productivity of people, as opposed to the signaling theory. The signaling theory might also be called the screening effect. You might hear that sometimes. So if you require one of these levels of education or skill or training or talent, then there's going to be a smaller supply of people and therefore a higher wage. But are there wages that can exist above the equilibrium? Yes, there are. And here's some of the reasons why. First, a minimum wage law. If it exceeds the equilibrium, then of course people are going to get paid more than what the marketplace dictates. Unions or workers' associations can come together to negotiate, known as collective bargaining, a higher wage than what goes on in the marketplace. And unions do tend to get 10 to 20% higher wages and benefits than non-union employees. And then there's such a thing as efficiency wages. And these are above equilibrium wages paid by some firms to increase worker productivity. So they're paying them above the equilibrium to get them to work harder. Or they're trying to attract higher quality job applicants from the labor pool. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are some things that can also disbalance the equilibrium. And one of them, of course, is what I just mentioned, when there are interferences either by the government or by unions or by firms sometimes to pay above the equilibrium. How can people be paid below the equilibrium? Often that happens through discrimination. And this is offering different opportunities to people, not based on their work or their productivity, but maybe based upon the characteristics that the employer has selected. And so there is some evidence to show with the data that there is a difference, and we already alluded to some of this, between men and women and also some other demographic groups. So the median earnings of full-time U.S. workers in 2007, for instance, white males earned 21% more than white females and 24% more than black males. So taken at face value, these differences look like evidence that employers do discriminate. But there are many other possible explanations that can go into that. So it doesn't necessarily take into consider everything. However, also, if you come up with explanations for that, like what I gave you originally, women take time off to have children. Maybe there is a lower rate among certain demographic groups, including African American men, for high school completion and college education and so on across the board. But if you say that, Yes, that explains why the pay is lower on average. However, it's still a problem that affects things like racial relations and possible discrimination that has lingering effects. And maybe there's no more legal discrimination, and maybe there's no major employers out there that are discriminating against African Americans, but there is this system that's intact basically from the time when segregation was legal, where African Americans are mostly living in areas that have lower property values, therefore their property taxes don't reap that much of a revenue for local school districts, so their local public schools maybe aren't up to par in comparison to those that have a majority white population. So you got to ask yourself is if we have gotten rid of the legal or de jure discrimination, should anything be done about these lingering effects that are occurring? Because there are people, for instance, in their 60s and 70s who did live through discrimination, and maybe their retirement isn't as high, and so they need more help from their families, and so their families have less money that they can support their own children because they have to support their elderly parents. Or maybe they, because of discrimination, their grandparents never owned their own home. So unlike their family who might be of European descent, for instance, who once they started to have kids, they inherited their parents' home, which would be their kids' grandparents, and they can move into something bigger. But maybe there aren't that as many opportunities, for instance, for African Americans or Latinos. And so it's easy to say, well, that's no one's business. We got rid of the discriminatory laws, but there's still this lingering impact, and there are still a significant proportion of people that are earning less money because they have a lesser education because of some of these lingering effects. And so it still does have real world implications that causes tension, it causes political problems, and it obviously is causing society to be less productive. If everyone had an equal education at least, and then they could take that and do what they could with their own lives, then overall society would be more productive in that particular scenario. And so the difference in wages are a sign that possibly we're not getting as much efficiency out of the system. So when it relates to education and labor, if we're looking at the production possibilities frontier, remember that bow-shaped curve. If we're on the interior of that, it means we're not being as efficient. And the difference in wages between men and women, and then those that are white and African American, is a sign that maybe in a labor market we're not being as productive as we could possibly be. And so those statistics aren't just something that we can easily brush aside, they are a sign of something deeper. And so there are studies also to show that maybe some actual discrimination still does occur. There was a study done by Bertrand and Mullinathon who found evidence of labor market discrimination. 5,000 fake resumes were sent in response to help wanted ads. Some were given stereotypical African American names, some were given stereotypical European names. The white names received 50% more calls from interested employers than the black names, and that was really the only difference between them, was the names themselves. And so it is possible that these kind of things also still do happen. So the question is how can the private sector deal with it? Competitive markets provide a natural remedy for employer discrimination. For example, non-discriminating firms can hire females from a lower wage, giving them a cost advantage in economic profits, which attract entry or other non-discriminating firms. And the result is the demand for female workers will end up increasing, and the demand for male workers falls until the wages are equalized. And so you might discriminate, for instance, against women, and then other firms are going to compete with you to try to attract more women into the workforce. And the more women you have, the lower the demand is for male workers. And so you end up having that equalized. Now, of course, the problem with that is, and it misses the point, that men's wages will fall and women's wages will rise, but they'll probably meet at a lower point than when men's were originally. And so if that does happen, then of course that means that everyone is worse off. But their point is, of course, is that the invisible hand, the marketplace, will attempt to find some type of middle ground or equilibrium point. So the discrimination can also happen because of consumers. People, of course, can choose not to go to some places. Suppose firms only care about maximizing profits, but customers prefer being served, for instance, by whites, then firms have an incentive to hire white workers, even if non-whites are willing to work for lower wages. Now, of course, that still involves an employer decision. But what happens if you're an employer? What happens if you owned a business in the Deep South in 1950 and you wanted to hire African American workers because you thought that was right, but then no one came to your business? And of course, the response might be, well, move north. But that obviously can have a long-term negative effect, and it can pressure businesses into practicing discriminatory practices they may not want to in the first place. And then, of course, there's government discrimination, and that can eventually have long-term negative effects because, as I pointed out earlier, you can have more and more society that is not productive if they're being discriminated against. And the long-run problem, of course, isn't necessarily going to just be discrimination, but it is going to be the issue of technology and the fact that more skilled workers and those with better training are more likely to be from the traditional role of white men, for instance. And even amongst white men, though, there is a group that is at the lower tier of the skill levels that used to be employable in factories, some skilled workers and many semi-skilled workers. But as technology replaces those people, you're going to have more and more automation and a less need for the supply of that labor. And so you're going to have a segregation that's going to occur where you have a lot of people at the top in the professional or highly skilled area that can work with technology. And then you're going to have people that are still needed to do jobs by hand in the unskilled area. And so you're going to have this huge gap that grows between the two. And the question is, as we end up replacing more and more jobs with technology, what are you going to do with all of the human labor that is available? And so you can see on the left here, one of the leading reasons for rising U.S. income inequality over the past 3 decades is that technological changes affected workers with some skill sets differently than others. And 88% of economists agree with that. Now, there are some other things like outsourcing, which is what people get angry about the most, but it is actually technology that has been responsible for much of the decrease in demand for labor.